This is Lecture 9 on medical healers and their roles. We've been considering in the last two lectures the world of animate nature, the realm of living things. First, we examined how natural philosophers in the 18th century came to arrange the myriad of all living things into a consistent system of classification. That happened primarily as the result of the work of Carl Linnaeus, whose arrangement of living things caught on and was widely adopted. We then brought our attention down to animal life in particular and considered the perplexing question, with its two fascinating answers, of how animal life develops from its embryonic beginnings into its many different adult forms. Some held that the adult organism was preformed already in the embryo. Others believed in the unfolding of the previously unorganized matter of the embryo into increasingly complex stages of development. So we moved from the general classification of all life down to a consideration of the development of animal life. Well, today our focus narrows even more. We want to look at one very specific organic being, Homo sapien. Our goal changes from the 18th century understanding of how our body develops to how to maintain it and how to repair it when it gets out of whack. What causes it to get out of whack anyway? Now, here's how we're going to proceed. The first thing to do is to inquire about how health and disease were understood in the 18th century. Medicine is like the other subjects we've considered. It had a long history, and that history contained a great deal of importance for the 18th century. Of course, there was a lot that changed in the 18th century, and we'll talk about that. But there were remarkably a lot of ideas about sickness and health that hadn't changed for a long time. Many of these ideas continued on into the 18th century. We're also going to take a look at the intriguing world of medical healers. That's the best word to use, healers. You might have thought I was going to be talking about physicians. I will do that, but one of the real benefits of recent historical scholarship is that it has opened up to us a different perspective on the history of medicine. Back in Lecture 1, I suggested that historians now are extremely sensitive to the likelihood that we carry conceptions that we formulate in the present with us when we go back to history and impose them on historical periods where they don't really belong. That's just as easy to do in the history of medicine as it is in the history of science in general, and it clearly has happened in the past. One way it has occurred is the focus that historians have traditionally placed on the activities of physicians. That's natural because when we think of medicine today, we think of physicians. So when historians went back to the history of medicine, they asked about what physicians thought and how they practiced medicine. But can we assume that the role of the physician in the past resembles the role of physicians we're thinking of from our own day? A big distinction is made today between physicians and others who make claims about health and disease. Was that always the case? And if so, was it the same distinction? In fact, I think it's important to note that we can't accurately describe healing practices of the 18th century if we impose on it an assumption that there was an accepted standard practice dominated by physicians. We're tempted to do that because we think of physicians as folks whose knowledge of health and disease differs drastically from that of alternative practitioners. But this kind of assumption just doesn't apply to the 18th century. As we'll see, the understanding of what health and disease are was basically the same among physicians and other kinds of healers in the 18th century. So much for distinguishing them because of the content of their knowledge. What about another way of distinguishing physicians from the large array of healers in the 18th century? Can't we at least distinguish healers who were officially recognized as legitimate from those who were not? This distinction between legitimate and not legitimate or non-legitimate practitioners was one that historians used to make automatically in traditional histories of medicine. And there were healers who were officially granted permission to practice their craft. But to judge healers according to whether or not they had a license is not a good way to approach the 18th century. We're going to see how it distorts what was there unnecessarily. Now, I've given you a lot of caveats about what we shouldn't do. Let me assure you, I'm not naive. I'm not trying to tell you that the portrait I'm going to paint of medical healers and their roles is the correct view of the 18th century. As I mentioned in Lecture 1, it's not that we must be sure that our ideas and our view is free from all distortions. I conceded that was impossible. But it is the case that we should try to correct the distortions that have been made in the past when we recognize them. I'll leave it to some future historians to correct whatever things that I'm bringing into the picture that aren't right. That's one of the nice things about choosing history as a profession. There'll always be a job. Well, one more preliminary thing. I'll be drawing on the situation in Germany in this lecture. It's the area I know best. But I found that the main contours of what scholars have concluded about the world of healing and the perception of sickness and disease in the German states have parallels in other countries during the 18th century. A great deal has been done of late on the history of medicine in many lands. The works are listed in your booklet, or some of them, and that's just a start. But they contain, in turn, lots of references for those of you who want to dig deeper. So as we begin, I want to note that there's something about medicine that's different from those subjects we've been considering. Most of the other subjects we've dealt with generally have involved rather esoteric knowledge. Think about it. There's only a small segment of society that cared much about astronomy or geology or chemistry or natural history. Alchemy, I concede, is an exception to some extent. I think there were more people who got involved in one way or another with it than with chemistry. This isn't the case with knowledge about healing. Healers came from virtually all segments of society, from the lowest ranks on up. And everyone was interested in knowledge about disease, especially when they were sick. Sickness was the great leveler of social rank. The king who had a disease was no more exempt from it than the pauper. Medicine, in other words, touched people's lives like no other area. And usually when it did so, it was accompanied by a certain urgency. Well, what was the common understanding of health and disease in the 18th century? The most important component of understanding of health in this era was that it depended mainly on the notion of balance. Now, there's nothing new in this. In fact, it was an ancient notion that continued to endure throughout the medieval and Renaissance periods on into the 18th century. Among factors we can control fell under the idea of dietetics. Now, dietetics was understood here in a very general sense, not the narrower one we have of it in the present. We think of dietetics as having to do only with food. Well, it did deal with food in the 18th century too, but it dealt with other factors as well. It was understood in the sense of general regimens. Here, dietetics was the observation of the regimens necessary to living a healthy life. What were the general rules one should follow to promote health? In establishing the traditions about how to promote good health, the first decision was, what are the things we can control? These were called the non-naturals. I find that an interesting name, an odd name for things we can control. It would seem that we would want to identify what was natural and do that. But that wasn't the way they looked at it in the 18th century and in the years before the 18th century. This tradition of the non-naturals went way back. How are we to understand what they meant by this name? Well, I believe the best way to understand it is to look at what might fall under the rubric of naturals. Then maybe we can figure out why the name non-naturals. Naturals were the things you couldn't do anything about. This referred to that inscrutable course of nature that did what it was going to do. Nature ran its course for reasons of its own. Now, we've been seeing in these lectures that more and more about the course of nature was being subjected to natural law. Well, that might mean that it was more predictable, but it didn't mean that you could do much to change it. So non-naturals then were things you could control. And there were 6 of them. And while they are kind of obvious, they can still be seen as basic to good health today. The non-naturals were fresh air, food, exercise, sleep, evacuations, and passion. Fresh air was the first. Notice here the emphasis is on fresh. That we can control, and we should. Again, of long standing, that foul air, people understood for a long time, foul air was not good for the health. Like I said, basic. Number 2 of the 6 non-naturals was food. There were various regimens given about food, as you can imagine, but there was a basic sense that what you took in was very important for your health. Again, true enough. Third, movement or exercise. It's within your power to exercise or not. You should do it if you want to stay healthy. We can imagine how this one was tied to that of the old social value of industry as opposed to laziness. Laziness is bad. It's not even good for your health. Sleep is number 4. Of course, we really can't control whether or not we sleep, but the understanding here was that you needed to get the right amount of sleep, and that you did control. Number 5 was the counterpart of number 2. It was evacuation or excretion. If food was what you took in, excretion was what you put out. If for some reason you were not controlling your excretions, you were going to be ill. If you saw the movie about the madness of King George III, that's George III of England, who was king during the American Revolution and on into the first decade of the 19th century, you'll remember how carefully the physicians regularly examined the king's excretions in trying to get a handle on his worsening condition. I like number 6 especially. It's passion. This one is something we should cultivate carefully. Too little passion, too much, both were to be avoided if you wanted to remain in good health. So, control the non-naturals: fresh air, food, exercise, sleep, evacuations, and passion. I think you could tell as we went through them that the watchword here was moderation. Don't permit an excess or a deficiency in any of them. Easier said than done, of course, but those are the rules. If you neglect things and let any one of them get out of balance, watch out. Now, of the 6, there were 2 that healers paid particular attention to, and they were food and evacuations, what you took in, what you put out. That cycle was pretty crucial. Clearly, what you ate was important to good health, but of all the 6 non-naturals, including food, the one that was easiest for a healer to address through intervention was evacuation or excretion. The others were pretty much up to you. Excretion, however, might require some assistance. You won't be surprised to learn that the most common diagnosis for illness was hampered evacuations. Something was wrong where sweat, urine, feces, or some combination of them was concerned. So balance among the humors and among the non-naturals was the best way to preserve and maintain good health. And disease resulted when there was an imbalance among the humors or when there was an excess or deficiency in the non-naturals. In order to restore moderation when it was absent, the most common remedies were bleeding and purgatives. If one of the humors had built up, bleeding was called for. For hampered evacuations, the natural cure was a purgative of some sort. We've all heard about how common it was to bleed people in the past, and maybe you're aware of the practice of giving purgatives as well. These were old practices that were still part of medicine in the 18th century. The most common remedies were bleeding and purgatives. If one of the humors had built up, bleeding was called for. For hampered evacuations, the natural cure was a purgative of some sort. We've all heard about how common it was to bleed people in the past, and maybe you're aware of the practice of giving purgatives as well. These were old practices that were still part of medicine in the 18th century. What's crucial to realize here is that healers of all kinds agreed about this. It was reinforced on all sides, first by long tradition, but in the 18th century, there arose a genre of popular literature on medicine, written by physicians, that also reinforced the message. Of course, that would be accessible only to those who could read, but reading as a pastime was itself on the rise. The important point, however, is that the belief about balance, and it did so with great precision. Physicians, for example, had the right to practice internal medicine, but only apothecaries could prepare and sell medicines. First-class surgeons did major surgery, but barber surgeons cut hair and also performed cupping, That's an ancient practice that you produce local congestion in an area of the body by creating negative pressure. It involved heating a cup and applying it to the body. And then because of the partial vacuum that's created, you draw blood into the region. Another officially sanctioned practitioner was the midwife. She had prerogatives over childbirth. Now, in addition to these licensed folk, there was a host of unlicensed healers out there. They included an array of people: bathmasters, oculists, dentists, peddlers, executioners, knackers, corn doctors, wise women, lithotomists, herniotomists, cowherds, and on and on. All these folks were out there offering one kind of medical service or another. And the district physicus was supposed to be on top of it all. Now, I mentioned earlier that the physicus had to answer to two authorities: a medical board and the local political authorities. In one region of Germany I'm familiar with, the first, the medical board, was known as the Collegium Medicum. It had been originated in the 1720s, and it stood right under the Privy Council of the Duke himself. The other authority to whom the physicus answered was the local mayor, maybe with a town council of some sort. The mayor also had to answer to the Duke's Privy Council. So the chain of command began with the Duke or King, who had his advisory Privy Council. They in turn oversaw the medical board and, of course, had jurisdiction over the local civic government. The poor physicus was the man on the spot. He had to make sure that all the rules were followed, and yet his pay came from the local town council. Now, I haven't said much about rules yet. What rules were there? Obviously, there were rules governing the acquisition of a license, say for apothecaries, and there were rules governing apprenticeships. But what about rules that applied to all those unlicensed healers? This raises the issue of quackery. Were these people all quacks? Well, the answer to that is sometimes. What do I mean, sometimes? Well, we've already established that virtually everyone agreed on what caused health and disease, so we can't distinguish quacks on the basis of what they believed health and disease to be. So who were the quacks? Quackery had a very precise meaning in this time and place. Quacks were those who poached on territory where they did not belong. Quackery had meaning primarily in an economic context. It undercut the livelihood of others. Clearly, those healers who had official permission to practice resented the many healers who practiced without permission. It was primarily an economic matter. Quacks were those who stole business and thus undermined the proper working of society. This meant that you could be accused of quackery even if you had an official sanction in one area but poached onto another's territory. A physician, for example, who dispensed medicine or set a broken leg could be, and in fact was, accused of quackery. The world of medical healers in the 18th century, then, was a pretty fluid place. People who could pay tended to go to a physician because if they could pay, a physician was closer to their social rank. Most people went to whomever they thought might help. This meant that legal boundaries didn't matter very much. People went back and forth from legal to illegal healers. Add to this that the authorities were always granting special permissions to individuals. Say, for example, a corn doctor had somehow convinced the authorities he could also pull teeth and gotten them to give him permission to do so. Well, this just meant that your choices of whom to go to were plentiful, to say the least. It really came down to whom you trusted. Or you went to lots of different kinds of healers. There was a case of consumption in 1767 that I read about, where a person went first to an executioner, then to a physician, then to a cowherd, and then to a different physician. People went back and forth across these boundaries, almost as if they didn't exist. You see why I said it's not a good idea to come to the 18th century with our assumption that legitimate and non-legitimate practitioners mean what they might today. Well, when did things begin to change in medicine and why? The consensus among historians appears to be that the turn from the 18th to the 19th century was a pivotal time. There's a well-known book by the famous historian philosopher Michel Foucault. It's called The Birth of the Clinic. It's cited in a lot of history of medicine texts on this question. Foucault refers to the turn from the 18th to the 19th century as the time when what he calls the firm web of our modern experience was set into place. He's speaking in the context of the history of medicine, and he's referring here to our modern medical attitudes. Foucault identifies these with what he calls the anatomo-clinical perception. That's when the physician's goal became replacing the patient with her body. In fact, he locates the symbolical precise point of this development in the work of the physician Xavier Bichat, especially his General Anatomy of 1803. Well, that may be when physicians' attitudes began to shift away from older traditions and more toward the kind of medical knowledge we might recognize. But what about the rest of it? What about the regulation of medical practice? What about quackery? What about the various levels of trust that people had in different kinds of healers? When did all that change? Well, I'm sure you've realized that there's a lot about what I've said here that hasn't really changed all that much. We still have large numbers of people who harbor a certain distrust of one kind of practitioner or another. Some distrust physicians, others distrust those that they regard as quacks. And speaking of quackery, there are still plenty of healers who are saddled with that term. There's one big difference. We have what, for better or worse, is called scientific medicine today. That didn't exist in the 18th century. But it is just this period, the time around the turn from the 18th to the 19th century, when the very understanding of what it meant to be scientific was emerging. Back in Lecture 1, I talked about the ideology of science. The German word was Wissenschaft. And that this emerged during the Enlightenment. It accompanied that general cultural upsurge in the German states during the second half of the 18th century. This was the systematic scholarly study of a discipline that was to replace the more haphazard study of previous eras. The sense was that in the past, intellectual investigations had codified what was known more than they engaged in research of the unknown. The goal was to make all intellectual disciplines into Wissenschaften, into sciences. That call was also heard in medicine as the century was coming to a close. In fact, medicine was criticized specifically for being way behind the curve. But all this was going to take some time. By that I mean, not only would it take time for medicine to become a science, but it would take time for a consensus to emerge about what being scientific meant. And that would only emerge in conjunction with the appearance of a practitioner of science. I have to remind you, we don't yet have scientists. There's no one in society who has that identity. Not until new terms like scientist in English and Naturwissenschaftler in German become socially recognizable will it even be possible to think of associating physicians with them. And these terms only become possible as the practice of science becomes professionalized. Now, we'll watch that happen in a later lecture, Lecture 28. So this was indeed a pivotal time for natural science and for medicine. In the case of medicine, it will be another half century before it acquires the label scientific medicine. Around mid-19th century, with the development of the germ theory of disease, the blending of medicine with experimental science becomes irresistible. By the time we come to Lecture 22 to discuss the work of Louis Pasteur on his new vaccines for anthrax and rabies in the 1880s, he'll seem to be both a chemist and a physician. All this is not to say that none in the 18th century itself tried to associate medicine with natural science. But that was hard to do when the meaning of scientific was so disputed. Now, we'll get a real good example of this when we meet a physician named Franz Anton Mesmer, whose new medical theory caused a sensation in pre-revolutionary France. And that will be the subject of our next lecture. Of one kind of practitioner or another, some distrust physicians, others distrust those that they regard as quacks. And speaking of quackery, there are still plenty of healers who are saddled with that term. There's one big difference. We have what, for better or worse, is called scientific medicine today. That didn't exist in the 18th century. But it is just this period, the time around the turn from the 18th to the 19th century, when the very understanding of what it meant to be scientific was emerging. Back in Lecture 1, I talked about the ideology of science. The German word was Wissenschaft. And that this emerged during the Enlightenment. It accompanied that general cultural upsurge in the German states during the second half of the 18th century. This was the systematic scholarly study of a discipline that was to replace the more haphazard study of previous eras. The sense was that in the past, intellectual investigations had codified what was known more than they engaged in research of the unknown. The goal was to make all intellectual disciplines into Wissenschaften, into sciences. That call was also heard in medicine as the century was coming to a close. In fact, medicine was criticized specifically for being way behind the curve. But all this was going to take some time. By that I mean, not only would it take time for medicine to become a science, but it would take time for a consensus to emerge about what being scientific meant. And that would only emerge in conjunction with the appearance of a practitioner of science. I have to remind you, we don't yet have scientists. There's no one in society who has that identity. Not until new terms like scientist in English and Naturwissenschaftler in German become socially recognizable will it even be possible to think of associating physicians with them. And these terms only become possible as the practice of science becomes professionalized. Now, we'll watch that happen in a later lecture, Lecture 28. So this was indeed a pivotal time for natural science and for medicine. In the case of medicine, it will be another half century before it acquires the label scientific medicine. Around mid-19th century, with the development of the germ theory of disease, the blending of medicine with experimental science becomes irresistible. By the time we come to Lecture 22 to discuss the work of Louis Pasteur on his new vaccines for anthrax and rabies in the 1880s, he'll seem to be both a chemist and a physician. All this is not to say that none in the 18th century itself tried to associate medicine with natural science. But that was hard to do when the meaning of scientific was so disputed. Now, we'll get a real good example of this when we meet a physician named Franz Anton Mesmer, whose new medical theory caused a sensation in pre-revolutionary France. And that will be the subject of our next lecture.